The oldest book in the Haverton Public Archive had no title on its spine. The cover was dark brown leather, cracked along the edges like dried riverbed mud, and the pages inside had gone the color of weak tea. Nobody checked it out. Nobody requested it. It sat on the third shelf of the restricted restoration section, behind a small rope that was more symbolic than functional, and it had been sitting there for longer than the colony itself had existed. Drav noticed it on his first day. He did not touch it. He simply looked at it for a moment, the way a person might look at an old friend they had not seen in a very long time. And then he picked up the card he had been assigned and went back to shelving. That had been 3 years ago. Now he arrived every morning before Reed did, which was saying something, because Reed Calloway arrived early. Reed was the kind of man who liked the archive best when it was empty and quiet, before the students came in with their bags and their noise, before the terminals filled up, before someone inevitably asked him where the bathroom was even though there was a sign. He liked the smell of it in the morning. Old paper and wood polish and the faint electrical hum of the climate control system working to keep the humidity exactly right. He liked the 10 minutes between unlocking the door and opening it to the public, when the archive was just his. Except Drav was always already there. Reed had stopped questioning this around the end of the first month. Drav had a key. Reed had given him one after the second week, because it was simpler that way, and Drav used it without explanation and without being asked. Every morning, Reed would come in and find the overnight repair queue already started. Books that had been flagged for loose bindings or water-damaged pages would be sitting on the restoration bench, either already fixed or in the middle of being fixed, surrounded by the small tools of the trade: bone folders, tissue paper, wheat starch paste in a little glass jar, a clean brush resting across the top. Drav himself would usually be somewhere in the stacks, moving quietly with a cart, returning things to their places with the kind of attention that most people reserve for much more important tasks. He was not a large man, by human standards. Compact was the word that came to mind. Somewhere in his late 30s, maybe, with gray eyes that were a shade too light and a stillness about him that Reed had never quite been able to put his finger on. He did not fidget. He did not check his communicator. He did not seem to get tired. He spoke clearly and without wasting words, and he remembered every single thing that was in the archive, not just where it was shelved, but what it said, when it was written, who had written it, and what 3 other texts a person should probably read alongside it. Reed, who had spent his entire adult life in libraries and considered himself reasonably knowledgeable, had quietly concluded that Drav knew more about the archive's collection than he did. This did not bother him. It was simply true, and Reed was the kind of man who preferred truth to comfort. What did occasionally bother him, in a mild, background way that he never quite got around to addressing, was the visiting academic from 3 weeks ago. She had come in from off-world, a Nhari woman with the characteristic pale gray skin and the careful, formal posture of her species, carrying a research credential from a university that Reed recognized as very prestigious and very far away. She had asked for access to the pre-contact xenolinguistics collection. Reed had pointed her toward the east wing. She had thanked him and walked in that direction, and then she had stopped. Drav had been at the far end of the east wing, sitting at the small desk near the window, annotating a catalog entry in his careful, precise handwriting. He had not looked up. The Nhari academic had gone completely still. Not the stillness of surprise, something deeper than that. The stillness of a person who has just seen something that does not fit inside their understanding of the world, and who needs a moment to decide what to do about it. She had stood there for nearly a full minute. Then she had turned around, walked back to the front desk, thanked Reed for his time, and left. She had not looked at the xenolinguistics collection. She had not looked at anything except Drav. Reed had watched this happen and filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept things he did not yet have context for. That evening, after the archive closed, he had been in his office going over the grant applications. There were always grant applications. The archive ran on a colonial budget that was never quite enough. When he heard Drav moving through the old section, the part of the archive that held the Earth-printed books, original printings, most of them, hauled across the void by colonists who had wanted to bring something of home with them. 20th century, largely. A few from earlier. Fiction, history, science, poetry, things that had no practical value whatsoever and were therefore, in Reed's opinion, essential. He got up quietly and looked through the glass panel in the office door. Drav was standing in the aisle between the shelves, not doing anything in particular. Not cataloging, not repairing, not shelving. Just standing there with one hand resting lightly on the spines of the books, running his fingers along them slowly, the way you might trail your hand along a railing as you walked. His eyes were closed. His expression was not one Reed had seen on him before. It was not the careful, neutral expression Drav wore during the day, the pleasant professional quiet of a man doing his job. It was something older and heavier and more open than that. It was the face of someone standing somewhere they had needed to be for a very long time. Reed went back to his grant applications and did not say anything about it. Some things, he had learned, a library holds better than a conversation can. The next morning, Drav was at the repair bench when Reed came in, mending the binding on a colonial agricultural record from 2287 that nobody had requested in 40 years. He was doing it with the same attention he gave everything, as if it mattered, as if whoever had written those old farming records down deserved to have their words held together properly, even now, even here, even if no one ever asked for them again. Reed hung up his coat, started the coffee, looked at the overnight repair queue. It was, as always, already half done. He put on his glasses. He did not technically need them anymore, but they helped him think, and settled in at his desk, and the archive opened for the day, and nothing happened that anyone would have called remarkable. Which was, if you knew where to look, not entirely true. 47 light years away, in a building that cost more than most planetary economies, a woman was losing her patience. Counselor Nessa Vale had been losing her patience for approximately 3 years, which was not her natural state. She was, by training and by reputation, one of the sharpest financial minds in the Galactic Union Trade Compact. She had negotiated infrastructure bonds across 9-star systems. She had settled a currency dispute between 2 species who had not agreed on anything in living memory. She had, on one notable occasion, talked a collapsing colonial economy off the edge of default using nothing but a spreadsheet and 4 hours of very careful language. She was good at her job. Her job required her to know where the money was. The problem was that a significant portion of the money had, for 3 years, been completely unreachable. The Veil Theory were not common. There were fewer than 200 of them in the known galaxy, which made them either the most endangered species anyone had ever dealt with or the most selective, depending on who you asked. They lived long lives, very long lives, and in those lives they accumulated wealth, knowledge, influence, holdings. Not out of greed, exactly, but out of the simple mathematics of existing for thousands of years in an economy that rewarded patience. The wealthiest of them was Dravith. Had been Dravith for longer than most civilizations had kept records. His asset portfolio was not something that could be described in ordinary numbers without those numbers losing meaning. It was easier to say that he owned, in whole or in part, enough of the interstellar financial infrastructure that his participation, or his absence, had measurable effects on trade across a significant portion of the known galaxy. He had been absent for 3 years. Not dead, not incapacitated. His accounts were active, in the sense that the holdings existed and were generating returns. He simply was not engaging with them. No transactions, no authorizations, no communications, no appearances at any of the dozens of financial and diplomatic events where his presence had previously been expected and relied upon. 3 trade agreements were on hold because they required his authorization of an underlying asset. 2 infrastructure development bonds had stalled because he was listed as the primary guarantor and nobody could reach him to confirm continuation. 1 small interstellar shipping consortium had quietly gone under because a refinancing deal they had been counting on had never cleared. Dravith's proxy authorization had simply never arrived, and after 18 months of waiting, the numbers had not held. Nobody had gone looking for him. The Veil Theory were not the kind of people you went looking for. They were the kind of people who found you, or did not find you, and both outcomes were their decision. But after 3 years of silence, Veil had done the thing that nobody wanted to do. She had filed a formal location inquiry with the Union Registry and started tracing the last known movements of a 6,000-year-old dragon who had apparently decided to stop answering his messages. The trace had taken 8 months. The result, when it finally came back, had required her to read it twice. She had then taken the information to Warden Oralbrast, head of colonial security on a mid-tier human farming world called Haverton's Rest, because that was where the trace ended. Brast was a large man with a straightforward face and the general demeanor of someone who had spent 20 years solving problems that had clear answers. Missing livestock, border disputes, the occasional bar altercation that got out of hand. He dealt well with things he could put his hands on. He was looking at the document Vale had placed on his desk with the expression of a man who had been handed something very heavy without warning. "This number," he said. "Yes," said Vale. "This is his net asset figure. A simplified version. The full figure requires scientific notation." Brast looked at it for a moment longer. Then he set it down carefully, as if the paper itself might be affected by what was written on it. "And you think he's here?" he said. "On Haverton's Rest. The signal trace puts him here. He entered on a valid travel permit 3 years ago. The permit has been renewed twice since then." Brast pulled up the colony entry log on his terminal. Vale watched him search. She watched his expression change as he found it. "Drav," he read. "Species, Vale Theory. Occupation listed as..." He stopped. "Go on," said Vale. "Library assistant. Volunteer." He looked up. "At the Haverton Public Archive." "Yes." "The library." "Yes." Brast leaned back in his chair. He was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, a field transport rolled past on its way to the grain processing facility 3 kilometers east. A perfectly ordinary afternoon on a perfectly ordinary colony world. Why would he? "That," said Vale, "is what I intend to find out." She did not say it unkindly, but she said it firmly, which was how she said most things. Meanwhile, on the other side of the colony, Reed Calloway was trying to write a grant application for the 3rd time this year, which was twice more than usual. The Colonial Heritage Fund had quietly reduced its contribution to the archive's operating budget, and 2 of the climate control units in the East Wing were showing age in a way that the maintenance reports were beginning to describe as urgent. He needed funding. The funding required an application. The application required him to explain, in formal language and within a word limit that felt designed to prevent any actual explanation, why a library mattered. He had written this argument many times. He would write it again. He was not particularly bitter about this, because bitterness took energy he preferred to spend elsewhere. Drav was at the other end of the office, quietly cross-referencing a newly donated collection of pre-compact surveying records. Someone had left them to the archive in a will. 3 boxes of physical documents, mixed formats, some of it in languages that were not immediately obvious. Drav had been working through the boxes for the past week. He had identified 14 documents of significant historical interest, 2 of which appeared to be the only surviving copies of their kind, and had noted all of this in the catalog with the same matter-of-fact precision he applied to everything. Reed watched him for a moment. "Drav," he said, "the Vale Theory surveying project from the early compact period. Do you know much about it?" "Some," said Drav, without looking up. "There is a reference in the 2301 colonial survey records to a Vale Theory observer who was present at the initial mapping of this system. I cannot find the corresponding name in any of the official records." Drav was quiet for a moment. His pen kept moving. The observer may have preferred not to be named. That is an unusual preference for someone on an official survey mission. "Some people," said Drav, "find official records to be a blunt instrument." Reed considered this. He put his glasses back on and returned to his grant application. He wrote 3 sentences, deleted 1, kept 2. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the reading room floor the way it always did at this hour, slow and wide and golden. His communicator buzzed with a message from the Colonial Administrator's office. A compact representative had arrived on Haverton's Rest and had requested an appointment with the director of the archive for the following morning. Reed frowned slightly. Compact representatives did not typically come to Haverton's Rest. There was not, in the usual run of things, very much here to represent. He confirmed the appointment, filed the message, and went back to his grant application. Drav did not look up, but his pen, for just a moment, stopped moving. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when something happens that should not be possible. It is not the silence of peace or concentration. It is the silence of a world briefly forgetting to make noise while it tries to understand what it is looking at. That silence arrived in the Haverton Public Archive at 17 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, when the front door opened and Counselor Nessa Vale walked in with two aides, Warden Brast at her side, and an expression that made the handful of remaining patrons instinctively gather their things. Reed was behind the front desk, going through the daily returns. He looked up. Vale was not hostile. She was precise, which in Reed's experience was sometimes harder to deal with. She wore the formal gray of the compact, and she held herself like someone who was used to rooms adjusting to her rather than the other way around. She looked around the archive once, taking in the shelves, the reading tables, the tall, narrow windows with their afternoon light, the quiet, ordered shape of the place, and then she looked at Reed. "Director Calloway," she said. "I am Counselor Nessa Vale, Trade Division, Galactic Union Compact. I apologize for arriving before our scheduled time. I need to speak with your assistant." Reed set down the stack of returns. He was a careful man, and careful men did not respond to things before they understood them. "Which one?" he said. "I have two." "The Vale Theory one," said Vale. There was, between the front desk and the restricted restoration section, a distance of roughly 30 meters. Reed looked in that direction. Drav was visible through the archway, standing at the restoration bench with a sheet of tissue paper in one hand, working on something that required his full attention, or at least it had been requiring his full attention 30 seconds ago. He had gone still. "Drav," Reed called. A pause. Then, "Yes. Someone here to see you." Another pause, shorter, this time, like a decision being made. Then the sound of the tissue paper being set down, and footsteps. And Drav came through the archway carrying the composure of a man who had walked through difficult rooms before and fully expected to do so again. He came to the front desk, and he looked at Vale, and Vale looked at him, and the two aides looked at their shoes, and Brast looked at the ceiling, and Reed looked at all of them trying to understand what exactly was happening in his library. "Counselor," Drav said. "Dravith," said Vale. Something about the way she said that name made Reed pay closer attention. It was not Drav's name, not the one on the volunteer register, not the one Reed had been using for 3 years. It was longer and it landed differently, the way a full, formal name lands when someone uses it to make clear they know exactly who they are talking to. Vale reached into the case her aide was holding and produced a document, physical paper, sealed with the trade compact's embossed mark, and placed it on the desk between them. "This is a formal notice of engagement requirement under the compact's active asset provisions. 3 standing trade authorizations require your signature. 2 infrastructure bonds are in review suspension pending your confirmation of guarantor status. You have been unreachable for 37 months. Reed looked at Drav. Drav looked at the document for a moment. Then he looked at Reed. His expression was carefully neutral, but beneath the neutral there was something that Reed read, after 3 years of working alongside this man, as the faint trace of reluctance. Not guilt, not surprise, just the look of someone who had been waiting, without particular pleasure, for a door to open that they had been hoping would stay closed a little longer. "I should have mentioned this," Drav said to Reed. "I imagined so," Reed said. Vale did not wait for the side conversation to conclude. "The compact requires your engagement, Dravith. The delay has had measurable effects on 9 separate financial instruments and has contributed to the insolvency of at least one smaller trade operation that was relying on your guarantor authorization." Reed said quietly, "How large is your asset portfolio, Drav?" Drav said nothing. Vale answered for him. She gave a number. Then she gave a different number, because the first one had only counted the liquid holdings. Then she mentioned the infrastructure percentage. Then she stopped, because Reed had gone very still, and she was professional enough to recognize when she had said enough. Reed took off his glasses. He looked at them for a moment. Then he put them back on. He turned to look at Drav with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that he was not fully equipped to complete. "You have been shelving books," Reed said. "Yes," said Drav. "For 3 years." "Yes." "And repairing bindings." "Yes." "And cataloging." "Yes." "While owning." "Yes," said Drav. "I understand how it appears." Vale watched this exchange. She had prepared for several possible versions of this conversation, but she had not prepared for a librarian. She pressed on, because pressing on was what she did. "Dravith, I need your commitment to travel to the compact capital within the week and clear the outstanding authorizations." After that, we can discuss whatever arrangement you prefer for ongoing engagement. But the immediate situation requires your physical presence and your authorization codes. Drav looked at the document again. He did not pick it up. I will consider it, he said. This was not the answer Vale had been expecting. She had expected either yes or a counter-negotiation. I'm sorry, she said. I want to be certain I heard you correctly. You will consider it. Yes. These authorizations have been pending for over 3 years. I am aware of that. The markets. I am aware of the markets. A very short silence. Vale drew herself up slightly, which was a thing she did when she was moving from conversation into formal proceedings. Then I have to inform you that continued non-engagement may require the compact to seek a legal review of your listed asset responsibilities under active participation clauses in the Union Treaty framework. You are welcome to do that, said Draft pleasantly. Brast, who had been standing by the door with his hands clasped behind his back, trying to look like part of the architecture, quietly sent a message to his deputy. The message said, I don't know what is happening, but I think I'm going to need someone to cover Friday. Reed, for his part, was thinking. He was looking at Drav with an attention that was different from usual, not the comfortable working familiarity of a supervisor watching a capable employee, but the sharper focus of a man trying to see something he had been standing too close to. From the back of the archive, through the far doorway, he could see Tula Finn, his part-time colleague, who had been there since noon and had apparently not left, who had been quietly listening to all of this from behind a shelving cart. She met his eyes. She did not look surprised. She raised her eyebrows very slightly, in the expression of a woman who has known something for a long time and is watching everyone else catch up, and then she began very calmly putting on her coat. Reed turned back to Drav. Vale was speaking again. Something about the legal framework, something about precedent, but Reed waited until there was a pause, and then he said, That's enough for today. Vale stopped. The archive closes at 5, Reed said. It is 4:32. I am going to ask everyone except Drav to please wait outside. He said it without particular force, the way a librarian says things, as a statement of fact, not a request, but without any aggression in it either. Just the quiet certainty of a man who knew whose building this was. Vale looked at him for a moment. She was not accustomed to being asked to leave rooms. But there was something in Calloway's manner, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of performance, that made argument feel beside the point. She gathered the document from the desk, nodded once, and walked out. Her aides followed. Brast, looking briefly grateful, followed them. The door closed. Reed sat down on the edge of the desk. Drav stood on the other side of it. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the archive returned to its usual sound, which was almost no sound at all. Why are you here, Drav? Reed asked. Not loudly, not with anger. Just the question, plain and direct, the way Reed asked most things when he actually wanted an answer. Truly, why this place? Why this job? Why Haverton's Rest? Drav looked at him. He looked, Reed thought, like someone who had been carrying an answer for a long time and was only now being given a reason to set it down. It is a long answer, Drav said. It's 28 minutes until close, said Reed. And I think you owe me at least that much. Outside, Vale stood on the front steps of the archive with her aides, watching the last of the afternoon patrons filter out, and waited for the world's wealthiest being to explain himself to a librarian in a colony that most compact members could not place on a map. She waited longer than she expected. She was, in the end, glad she did. Reed made tea. He did this not because it was a calming ritual, though it was, but because the kettle was there and the situation called for something to do with his hands while Drav arranged his thoughts. Reed had interviewed enough people in his life, students, donors, grant reviewers, confused patrons, to know that some conversations needed a few minutes of ordinary noise around them before they could begin properly. He set a cup in front of Drav. Drav looked at it the way he sometimes looked at things that were new to him, with a precise, unhurried attention, as if he was filing it correctly. Then he wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at Reed. How old do you think I am? Drav asked. Reed considered. Late 30s, he said. Maybe 40. You do not have the look of someone who has spent much time worrying. I am 6,041 years old, said Drav. Give or take 2 decades. I was uncertain of the exact figure even at the time. Reed nodded. He did not do anything theatrical with this information. He nodded the way he nodded when a patron gave him a piece of context that changed how he understood a question, taking it in, adjusting, continuing. All right, he said. Go on. Drav looked at the tea. He did not drink it. He almost never ate or drank anything, which Reed had noticed and put in the same mental folder as everything else. But he seemed to find the warmth of the cup useful. In 6,000 years, Drav said, I have watched 11 civilizations complete what I would call their full arc. They rose, they organized, they built, they changed the shape of their corner of the galaxy, and then they ended. Not all of them ended in disaster. Most of them simply stopped. They reached a point where the thing that had made them remarkable became something they managed instead of something they lived. The urgency went out of them. They became very good at administering what they had, and they forgot why they had built it. He paused. Reed waited. The Veil Theory came close to this once. Very long ago. We recovered, but only because someone wrote it down. He said this quietly, as if it were a private thing. Someone in the darkest part of that period sat down and wrote out what we were losing and why it mattered, and that document survived. And 200 years later someone found it, and read it, and understood it. That is the only reason I am here, 6,000 years later. Because someone was afraid of forgetting, and they wrote it down. Reed turned the teacup in his hands. You watch for civilizations that write things down, he said. Not a question, just the shape of the understanding forming. I watch for civilizations that write things down for the right reasons, Draft said. There is a difference. Many species write. They record. They preserve. They build archives and libraries and vaults of information that are, in their way, very impressive. But they write to preserve what they have decided is important. They write because administrators require it, or because scholars demand it, or because the law mandates records. They write from the top down. He looked at the shelves through the archway. From where they sat, they could see the nearest stacks, the general history section, unremarkable, a little worn in the way that well-used things get worn. Humans write from the bottom up, he said. You write the formal records, yes, but you also write the other things. The personal accounts, the diaries that no one asked for, the letters that were never sent, the poems that nobody published, the logbooks of ships that never made it back. You write when you are frightened. You write when you are in love. You write when something has happened to you, and you cannot bear for it to not exist somewhere outside of you. You write because you are, and I have spent 300 years trying to find a more precise word for this, because you are afraid of disappearing. Reed was quiet. Outside, the colony evening was beginning. The sky going orange through the tall windows, the distant sound of a farm transport on the road that ran behind the archive. 3 years ago, Draft said, I reviewed a grant application. The Interstellar Heritage Compact had declined it. Too small, too regional. It was a request for restoration funding for this archive's pre-contact collection. He looked at Reed. You wrote it. Reed said nothing. It was not an elegant document, Draft said. It did not use the formal language that grant applications prefer. It was honest. It said, in plain words, that the people of this colony needed to be able to reach backward and touch the words of people who had been alive and afraid and uncertain long before them. It said that a civilization which loses its past cannot understand its present. It said these things without any cleverness, without any attempt to impress. It simply said them. Reed thought, with mild embarrassment, that he remembered writing that application. He had been frustrated when he wrote it. The word count had felt strangling, and he had abandoned the careful formal language halfway through and just said what he meant. I funded the restoration, Draft said, anonymously, and then I came to see the library. And you stayed, Reed said. I stayed, said Draft. A silence, not uncomfortable. In 6,000 years, Draft said, I have visited a very large number of repositories of knowledge. I have seen great vaults on capital worlds. I have seen collections that took centuries to assemble. I have seen libraries that required credentials to enter, that charged access fees, that kept their most important holdings behind levels of permission that most ordinary people could not reach. All of them very impressive. All of them, in various ways, sealed. He looked at Reed steadily. This library does not lock its door from the outside, he said. You open in the morning, and anyone can walk in. A student with no credentials. A farmer who wants something to read. A child who wandered away from their parents. They can walk in and ask for whatever they need, and you will help them find it without asking why they want it, without checking what they are authorized to access, without making them feel that the knowledge is being granted to them as a favor. You simply help. Reed said, a little uncomfortably. That is what libraries are for. Yes, said Draft. That is exactly what I mean. They sat with that for a moment. I have been trying to understand it, Draft said. That is partly why I stayed. I wanted to watch how it worked. How you make the decisions you make. What to preserve, what to restore, how you treat the things no one has asked for in 40 years. The agricultural records. The personal diaries of colonists who died before anyone thought to call them historical figures. You treat them all the same, with the same care. Everything in here was important to someone, Reed said, a little stiffly. I don't think I get to decide it stops being important. No, said Draft. You don't think you do? That is the thing I cannot find anywhere else. Reed thought about this for a long moment. He thought about the grant application he had written in frustration. He thought about the Nahari academic who had seen Drav and gone still. He thought about 6,000 years of watching civilizations, and what it might look like from that distance to find something you had been looking for. And Counselor Vale? He said, coming back to the practical problem, because that was also who Reed was. The trade agreements. The infrastructure bonds. Drav's expression shifted slightly. The quiet warmth of the last half hour did not leave it, but something older and more tired came into it alongside. I do not want to go, he said simply. Reed nodded. He turned his teacup. He thought. I may have an idea, he said, but it will require you to look at some heritage law documents with me. Drav looked at him. Something shifted in his gray eyes, a very faint change, the way light shifts when a cloud moves. What are you thinking, he asked. Reed put down his teacup and opened his desk drawer and found the copy of the Galactic Heritage Compact Treaty that someone had donated to the reference collection 8 years ago and that he had never quite found a reason to return. He set it on the desk between them with a solid, purposeful sound. I am thinking, Reed said, that a library is a remarkable piece of infrastructure and that the compact has, in my experience, very little imagination about what that word can mean. For the first time since Drav had walked out of the restoration room that afternoon, something moved across his face that was not careful or controlled or ancient or tired. He almost smiled. The Galactic Heritage Compact Treaty was 612 pages long in its standard edition, and Reed Calloway had read most of it, which was not the sort of thing most people could say. He had read it years ago, during a period when the Colonial Heritage Fund had tried to reclassify the archive as a secondary storage facility rather than a primary cultural institution, which would have cut the operating grant by 40%. Reed had fought that reclassification with citations from the treaty and won, which was one of the more satisfying things he had done in his career, and he had kept the book on his desk ever since. He opened it now to Part 7, which dealt with the protections afforded to sites of civilizational significance. He found the section he wanted. He turned the book to face Drav and pointed. Drav read it. He read the way he did everything, with total attention and no wasted motion. He did not need to read it twice. He looked up at Reed. A Veiltheri cultural custody designation, Reed said. Under this clause, any Veiltheri individual may formally designate a site as being under their personal cultural stewardship if it meets the criteria for civilizational heritage value. Once designated, the site receives permanent legal protection under the Union Treaty framework. It cannot be defunded by a colonial government. It cannot be reclassified. It cannot be subject to budget review by any party other than the designated custodian. Drav looked at the page again, and the custodian is required to remain listed as the site's registered steward. Yes, said Reed, but the treaty does not specify that the custodian must be physically present at the site at all times. It only requires that they maintain engagement with the site's preservation and remain reachable for heritage-related decisions. He watched Drav work through the implications. It did not take long. This would allow me to remain in my current role, Drav said carefully, while also maintaining a legal connection to this archive that would require any party, including the Trade Compact, to route any request for my engagement through the Heritage Protection Framework first. It would not stop them from reaching you, Reed said, but it would mean any attempt to compel your travel or your time would have to navigate heritage treaty law, which is complicated and slow and, in my experience, tends to make legal departments very unhappy. A pause. It would also, Drav said, give this archive permanent protection. That is the part one I'm most interested in, Reed said honestly. Drav looked at the book for a moment longer. Then he looked at Reed. You would have to agree to the designation. The site's current director is required to consent. Yes, said Reed. I consent. He said it simply, without ceremony, the way he said most things, and Drav looked at him for a moment with that same expression Reed had seen through the office window on the night he had stood in the old book section, the heavy, open thing that had no good word for it. All right, Drav said. The treaty required a formal filing, which Drav produced the following morning. It was 6 pages long, citing 47 separate provisions of the Heritage Compact in correct order with accurate cross-references. Reed had spent 4 years on a filing that cited 12 provisions. He did not comment on this. Vale was given a copy at the hotel where she was staying, which was the only hotel on Haverton's Rest, which had been built to accommodate traveling grain inspectors and did not normally receive trade compact counselors. She read it in under an hour and appeared at the archive at 9 in the morning, which was 45 minutes after it opened. She had the look of a person who had slept on a problem and found it unchanged. Reed offered her a seat at the reading table. He offered her tea. She accepted the seat and declined the tea with a politeness that was clearly costing her some effort. Drav came out of the restoration section and sat down. He had apparently been repairing the crumbling old book from the restricted shelf, the one with no title, the one he had noticed on his first day. He was wearing thin conservation gloves. He did not take them off. This is a legal instrument, Vale said, placing the filing on the table. Yes, said Drav. It designates the Haverton Public Archive as a Vale Theory Cultural Custody Site under Article 7 of the Heritage Compact Treaty. Yes. Which means, Vale said, controlling her voice carefully, that any request for your engagement by any party, including the Trade Compact, must be submitted through the Heritage Review Office, which has a standard processing time of 6 to 18 months. Yes. A silence. Vale breathed in slowly, breathed out. Dravith. The trade agreements. I will authorize them remotely, Drav said. I can do that today. The authorization codes can be transmitted from here. I can also set up a proxy authorization structure for routine matters, which I should have done before now. I will remain available for significant decisions by correspondence. What I will not do is return to the capital indefinitely and disengage from my work here. Vale looked at the filing. Then she looked at Reed, as if she was trying to understand which of the two of them was actually responsible for this. Reed looked back at her with the same quiet, steady attention he gave everything. You have a copy of the full Heritage Treaty Framework in your reference collection, Vale said to him. Not quite an accusation. More like someone noting a fact that they found unexpected. In the reference section, yes. Donated copy, 2309 edition. If you need the more recent amendment appendix, I can request it through the interlibrary system. It would take about a week. Vale stared at him. You read the Heritage Treaty. I read most things that come through here, Reed said. Another silence. Brast, who had come in behind Vale and was standing near the door, was looking at the floor with the expression of a man trying very hard not to find anything funny about a situation that he had decided it would not be professionally appropriate to find funny. Vale set down the filing. She was quiet for long enough that Reed could hear the climate control system cycling in the East Wing. Then she said, the Trade Compact will accept the authorization codes transmitted remotely and review the proxy structure you propose. We will require a confirmed communication schedule, no less than quarterly, for significant financial decisions. Quarterly is acceptable, Drav said. The Heritage Custody designation will stand, pending a standard review of the site's eligibility, which I expect to take approximately 4 months, Drav said. Under Article 7, Section 3, the review period is capped at 4 months for sites nominated by a living Vale Theory custodian. There are not many of us, and the treaty was written to accommodate our schedules. Vale closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. 4 months, she said. Fine. She picked up her case. She stood. She was, Reed thought, a genuinely impressive person. She had walked into a situation that had not gone the way she planned, in a way she had not anticipated, in a building she had not expected to matter, and she was leaving it with her professional dignity entirely intact. He respected that. At the door, she stopped. She turned back, and she looked at Reed with the air of someone who wants to ask a question and is deciding whether it is worth the answer. "Why aren't you more alarmed by all of this?" she asked. "You discovered today that your library assistant is a 6,000-year-old dragon of nearly incalculable wealth who has been spending his time repairing old books. Most people would be somewhat more. He is very good at repairing old books," Reed said. "And he remembers where everything is. That is harder to find than you might think." Bill looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her expression that Reed could not quite read. Not quite amusement. Not quite exasperation. Something more complicated than either. She left. Brast paused in the doorway long enough to tell Reed that his people would be there Friday for the box moving. Reed thanked him. The door swung closed. Drav looked at Reed. Reed looked at Drav. The archive was quiet. The morning light was coming through the east windows at the long, low angle it came through at this time of year, touching the tops of the shelves, turning the old spines of the books a warm, faded gold. "You could have asked me anything for this," Drav said. "The designation protects the archive permanently. You could have asked for endowment funds, construction, an entirely new wing, anything you needed." "I know," said Reed. "You asked for nothing." "I asked for you to stay," Reed said. That seemed like enough. Drav was quiet for a moment. Then he took off the conservation gloves and set them on the table, and he went back to the restoration bench, and he picked up the old book with no name on its spine, and he continued the careful, patient work of putting it back together. Reed put his glasses on and went back to his desk. Tula Finn arrived at noon, as she always did on Thursdays. She came through the front door, hung up her coat, and looked around the archive. Everything was in its place. Drav was at the restoration bench. Reed was at his desk. The returns were sorted. The catalog queue was updated. She made coffee. It was terrible. She had learned from Drav, and Drav had apparently learned from no one. She brought Reed a cup without being asked and went to start on the periodicals. Nothing, from the outside, looked any different. Everything, from the inside, had changed. 6 months passed the way time passes in a library, not slowly and not quickly, but with a kind of depth to it. Each day added something small. Each week left a mark you would not necessarily notice until you looked back. The East Wing got its new climate control units in the 3rd month. They were installed by a colonial contractor who did not ask where the funding had come from, and Reed did not explain. The work took 4 days and was loud enough that Drav moved his restoration work to the back office and complained about nothing, which was how Drav complained. In the 4th month, the Heritage Custody designation was officially confirmed by the Galactic Union Review Panel, which had taken 3 months and 26 days, 3 days faster than the 4-month cap, a fact that the review committee noted in their report as being consistent with the treaty's provisions and not at all influenced by knowing who the custodian was, which Reed thought was probably technically true and practically nonsense. With the designation came access. 6 private collections on 5 different worlds, held in the estates of individuals and institutions who had never known quite what to do with documents they had inherited and could not read, were transferred to the Haverton Archive under the Heritage Access Clauses. 3 of the collections were in languages that Reed could not identify. Drav cataloged all of them within the week. New staff arrived. A young woman named Petra who had just finished her archival training and had been looking for a placement, and a part-time assistant named Corin who worked Tuesday through Thursday and was, Reed discovered quickly, exactly the kind of person who would become a librarian for life. They were told that Drav was the senior archive specialist. They were not, initially, told anything else. Petra figured it out at the end of her 2nd week. She came to Reed quietly and asked him, with great care, whether the reason Drav had been able to translate an entire box of Thurvani documents without referencing a single lexicon was because he was not actually human. Reed told her the short version. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if she could be assigned to work with him on the new acquisitions. Reed said yes. Corin figured it out at the end of his 2nd month, in a different way. He came in one morning and found Drav sitting alone in the old section before the archive opened, which he had heard about, but not yet witnessed. He stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. He was not alarmed. He was quiet, and then he said, softly, so as not to interrupt whatever was happening, "How long have you been coming here?" And Drav had looked up and said 6 months, and Corin had nodded and gone to start the returns and had never mentioned it again. The Thirvani scholar's name was Marit. She had arrived in the 5th month on a visiting researcher permit. Working from the collection that Drav had annotated in the first week's read had known him. She was careful and serious and spent long hours at one of the reading terminals, and she drank a great deal of the archive's very bad coffee without apparent complaint. In the 6th month, she found something. It was buried in a set of pre-compact agricultural records, the kind of records that had been written by farmers for farmers, practical and unpolished, the kind that most research institutions did not prioritize. A passing reference, repeated in 3 different documents across a span of 40 years, to an agricultural technique that modern Thirvani scholarship had assumed was lost when the old settlement records were destroyed. The technique itself was not revolutionary, but its existence, documented in plain, unimportant farming language, answered a question that had been open in Thirvani historical agriculture for nearly 2 centuries. Marit came to find Reed in the late afternoon, when the archive was quiet and the golden hour light was on the floor and the last few patrons were thinking about leaving. "I need to tell you," she said, and she was holding her tablet against her chest with both hands, the way people hold things when the thing is important. "This collection, the old farming records from the East Box, there is documentation here of the Thirvani secondary root cultivation sequence. We believed it was gone. We have believed it was gone since the Great Reclassification in 2244. Every major research institution has it listed as lost." Reed looked at her. "It wasn't a farming record," Marit said. "A record of a farmer writing down his seasonal routine. He was not writing for scholarship. He was writing so he would not forget. And because he did not want to forget, it survived." She looked like she was working very hard not to let her voice change. Reed had seen this in the archive before. People arriving at something they had been looking for without knowing they were looking for it. It looked the same every time. It looked like relief, and it looked like grief, and it looked like something else that had no name, all at once. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping this. For keeping all of it." Reed said, "Thank you for reading it." He meant it. Both of them knew the difference. Later, after closing, Reed found himself in the old section. He had not specifically decided to go there. His feet had taken him, which was a thing that happened sometimes after a day that had been heavy with meaning. He needed to be somewhere quiet and surrounded by things that had survived a long time. Drav was already there. Of course he was. He was sitting on one of the low wooden stools that lived in the section for no official reason and had been there longer than any staff member could account for. He had what looked like a personal book in his hands, not an archive holding, but something of his own, old and thick-spined, with a cover that Reed did not recognize. Reed pulled up the other stool and sat down. Neither of them spoke for a while. The archive was fully closed now, the building breathing its own private air, holding its contents in the dark with the same uncomplicated faithfulness it showed every night. "How many libraries have you been in?" Reed asked eventually. "In 6,000 years. Drav thought about it. Many hundreds. Perhaps over 1,000, if you include private collections of significant size. What did they look like?" "In the early periods they were temples," Drav said. "The knowledge and the religion were the same thing, or very close to it. Access was controlled by the people who managed the sacred. Later they became academies, better, in some ways, because they acknowledged learning as something separate from worship, but still limited. You needed to be the right kind of person. You needed credentials, affiliation, endorsement." He turned a page in his book, not reading it, just turning it. The knowledge became a resource. It was held by people who had it for people who needed it, and the people who held it decided who needed it and how much and under what conditions. Reed looked at the shelves around them. The earth-printed books, their spines faded, their titles worn down by time and handling. Most of them had been read many times. Some of them had been read once, badly, and returned to the shelf and never touched again. He had no way of knowing which had mattered most. He did not think the archive should be the one to decide. "You said before that this library has a door that opens outward," Reed said. "That it has no lock on the outside." "Yes." "That is not unique to us. Other libraries." "Some others," Drav agreed. "But you built this. Here, on a farming colony with a grain budget and 60 daily visitors, most of whom are looking for agricultural manuals or children's books. You did not build it because it was prestigious or because it would attract scholars or because it demonstrated the colony's sophistication. You built it because the people here needed it to be there. He paused. The children's books matter, Reed, as much as the Thurvani agricultural records. You know this. You have always acted as if this were obvious. It is not obvious. I have been looking for it for a very long time. Reed was quiet. He thought about Marate holding her tablet against her chest. He thought about a Thurvani farmer, 200 years dead, writing down his seasonal routine so he would not forget. Do you think we will be all right? Reed asked. He meant it broadly. Humans, the colony, the small fragile project of trying to hold things together. As a species, in the long run. Drav considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. He did not offer false comfort. 6,000 years had not left him sentimental about outcomes. I do not know, he said. I have watched 11 civilizations complete their arc. I cannot tell you with certainty that yours will not also end. But I can tell you that the ones I have watched lose themselves all shared one thing. They stopped writing the small things down. They preserved the official record, and they let the other things go. The farming notes. The letters. The diaries no one asked for. When a civilization decides that only the important things are worth keeping, it has already made a very dangerous decision about who gets to define important. He looked at the shelves. You have not done that yet, he said. That is the only thing I can tell you with certainty. Reed nodded. He sat with that for a while. Then he stood up, because there was always something to do, and the morning queue would not sort itself. And he was the kind of man who slept better knowing the next day was ready for him. He pushed the stool back to its place. He looked at Drav, who had not moved from his own stool and did not look like he planned to. Will you lock up? Reed asked. Yes, said Drav. Don't stay too late. I won't. He would. They both knew it. He would sit in the old section for another hour at least, with his book open in his hands, surrounded by things that humans had been afraid to lose and had therefore taken the trouble to keep. He had been doing it long before Reed arrived for work in the mornings, and he would be doing it long after Reed said goodnight. This was, apparently, the shape of 6,000 years of living, finding the things that mattered and staying close to them. Reed walked out through the archive, through the general stacks, through the reading room with its empty chairs, past the front desk, and out through the front door, which opened outward, as it always had, as it always would. He walked home under the Haverton sky, which was very large and very dark and full of stars that each had names, and behind him the archive held its contents in the quiet, and Drav sat among the old books, and somewhere in the east wing the new climate control hummed steadily in the dark. The next morning, Reed came in and Drav was at the restoration bench. The coffee was already made. It was, as always, terrible. Reed drank it without complaint, because some things were simply part of the shape of a good day, and this was one of them. The door opened at 9. 63 people came through it that day. Some of them knew what they were looking for. Some of them did not. All of them were helped, without condition, without judgment, without being made to feel that the knowledge was something being lent to them out of generosity. It was simply there. It had always been there. That, in the end, was the whole of it, and it was enough.